How did David defeat Goliath? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Samuel on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 38 to 51. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 38. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning of verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all his assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Israel is preparing to go to battle with the Philistines, but there is a problem. They are afraid due to the presence of Goliath, a man who stood about 9 feet tall, towering over all of them, not only in stature, but in strength and weaponry. With God's help, of course, Israel should have had faith to defeat Goliath. But remember, the Lord had rejected Saul as king by this point, and so Saul's faith was weak, if existent at all. This led to Saul being afraid, which led to Israel's army being afraid. David, though, was not afraid. The Lord had delivered him from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, and so David was confident that God would deliver him from the hand of the Philistine. And he was confident that God would do that, not for David's sake, but for Israel's sake. For this Philistine had defied the armies of Israel, the armies of the living God, even if those armies stood in fear. Seeing David's faith, Saul finally agreed to let David go out into battle, even as a youth. But he didn't want him to go out undefended, so he gave David his armor to wear. Recall back from chapter 9 that Saul is a particularly tall man in Israel, something we're not told of David. Thus, if David tried to wear armor that was made for someone taller than him, not only would it be too big, it would also be too heavy, making it hard to walk. And for a youth such as David, one who is not accustomed to war, that could be very well disastrous. So because he did not have time to prove the armor and practice in it, he gave the armor back and went into battle in his regular clothes, accompanied only by his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones that he gathered from a brook in the valley. You might ask, if David was so confident in the Lord, why didn't he only take 1 stone? because he didn't know how the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hand, but he knew that he would. So David came prepared for whatever situation he would face. Now naturally, when Goliath, a fully armored giant, saw the much smaller, unarmored youth coming towards him, he scoffed. He was insulted that Israel was treating him as a dog by sending him a stick. So insulted was Goliath that he cursed David by the names of his gods, telling David that his flesh would be used to feed the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. But this didn't frighten or deter David. David responded that he came to Goliath in the name of the Lord of hosts, the only true God of this universe, and one who time and again had defeated the Philistines. It would be that God who would deliver Goliath's head into the hand of David and would feed Goliath's carcass to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And when God did this, all the earth would know that there is a God in Israel and that he doesn't save with the sword or spear. The battle belongs to the Lord, and he would be the one who would deliver David. The stage was set for battle then. Goliath arose, and with his heavy, cumbersome armor advanced into the valley. Now he wouldn't have been moving so quickly because of that heavy armor, which gave the unarmored, agile David an advantage. So it was that David took one of the 5 stones he had and slung it at Goliath. When pictures are drawn of this event, we often see David depicted using a childlike slingshot made of wood with a large rubber band used to sling the stone into the air. That is not what David would have used. Instead, David's slingshot looked rather like a large eye patch. It consisted of a small piece of leather or cloth with 2 cords attached to opposite edges. The stone missile would be placed on the material and the cords pulled taut so that the material became a kind of bag containing the stone. The bag was held by the left hand and the ends of the 2 cords held together by the right. The bag was then swung round and round several times above the head until it gained the required momentum, at which point one of the cords would be released, shooting the stone missile forward. To show you how powerful these slingshots could be, by the time we get to Roman times, the projectiles could reach speeds of 160 kilometers an hour or 100 miles an hour, carrying with it the stopping force comparable to a .44 Magnum revolver. While David's stone may not have reached those speeds, it was fast enough, for when he slung his stone, it hit Goliath square in the forehead, a part that would have been unprotected by his helmet, severely stunning him and forcing him to fall to the ground. Now Goliath wouldn't have been dead, but he would have been severely injured. But David didn't have a sword. No matter though, for David used Goliath's sword to cut off the giant's head. Goliath was defeated with 1 stone and a slingshot, but in reality, God was defeated by the Lord. David's faith in the Lord allowed David to enter the battlefield in the first place armed only with a slingshot. David's faith caused him to sling the stone in spite of the giant's taunts. And David's faith left the rest up to God. As a shepherd, David would have been very accurate at using his slingshot, but that it only took 1 stone, God was blessing the work of David's hands. The battle and the victory belong to the Lord, something we should never forget. We'll finish this story, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, I hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 52 to 58, as we continue our walk through the Bible, 1 verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.